have you ever had this, I don't know, this nagging intuition that the stories of ancient spiritual resistance were just, well, deliberately buried, like someone hid them to keep you docile?
Oh, that is a heavy question right out of the gate.
I mean, think about it. Imagine you're holding a Bible, right? You flip through the pages, you pass the Gospels, you get to the very last page of the book of Revelation, and suddenly you realize, wait a second, there are actually dozens more books right behind it.
Just a massive collection of texts you didn't even know existed.
Exactly. Books you have never seen, stories you have never heard, and honestly, a completely different spiritual universe that you have just never been allowed to explore.
It really does shatter that whole paradigm of a uniform, universally agreed upon scriptural library, doesn't it?
It completely shatters it, and that is exactly why today we are taking you on a deep dive into the impenetrable highlands of East Africa.
We have some incredibly fascinating material to get through today.
We really do. We've got a stack of sources in front of us, specifically scripts and excerpts from two works. One is called The Lost Heroes of the Meqabyan, and the other is Unveiling the Meqabyan, Ethiopia's Suppressed Books of Spiritual Resistance.
Right.
And our mission for this deep dive is to explore the uniquely Ethiopian books of 1, 2, and 3 Meqabyan. We're going to look at how they radically differ from the traditional Western canon that most of you might be familiar with.
And crucially, we need to unpack our source's pretty explosive claim that these texts were intentionally suppressed by institutional religion.
Yeah, the claim that they were hidden to keep populations compliant. But before we get into the weeds on that.
Yeah, I want to jump in and frame how we are approaching this today, because it's important to set some ground rules.
Absolutely, go ahead.
We're looking at these claims today not to validate some grand conspiracy theory, about corrupt European councils deliberately hiding texts in smoke-filled rooms.
Right, that's a whole different historical debate.
It's exactly a debate for another day. We aren't endorsing the source's claims about malicious Western theologians. Instead, our goal is strictly analytical. We are going to impartially unpack the arguments and the incredibly fascinating ideas contained within these specific source materials.
So you, the listener, can actually understand the mechanics of these ancient texts and why they're causing such a stir right now.
Precisely. We are just reporting on what the text says and why it matters.
We are just the guides on this tour, but I'm telling you, the scenery is wild because most of us have a very fixed idea of what constitutes the biblical canon. You think of it as a closed final product.
A neatly bound book.
Right. If you grew up around the Protestant tradition, you probably think of a book with exactly 66 individual texts inside it.
And if you have a Catholic background, your number is 73.
But the Ethiopian Canon Library, here's where it gets really interesting. It contains a staggering 88 books.
88. I mean, just let that number sink in. It is a massive expansion of what constitutes sacred literature.
It's wild. To put that into perspective, it's like having a favorite movie that you've watched 100 times. You know every line, you know every character arc.
Right. You know it by heart.
And then suddenly, someone hands you a director's cut that is 30% longer.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and it's not just a few deleted scenes either. It contains entirely new storylines, new protagonists, and a fundamentally different philosophical undercurrent.
It changes the entire meaning of the movie.
Exactly. That is essentially what we're looking at with the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. But before we even look at what is actually inside these extra books, I have to play devil's advocate on the framing here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Our sources frame this as an intentional preservation against a Roman purge, right? They describe these monks deep in the highlands, protected by impenetrable mountains and deep gorges in East Africa.
Very dramatic imagery.
Very. But were they really, isolated in the sense of actively hiding from the West? Or did they just develop a completely independent tradition that simply didn't care about what Roman councils were decreeing thousands of miles away?
That is the crucial distinction we have to make, because geography is absolutely destiny in this scenario.
How so?
Well, the Ethiopian highlands are historically renowned for their rugged, fortress-like terrain. And our sources lean heavily on this imagery of deep gorges and sheer cliffs because it physically represents their theological argument.
Oh, so the landscape is a metaphor for the theology.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the thesis presented in our texts is that the Roman Empire and subsequent European church councils like Nicaea and others, they opted for a centralized hierarchical narrative to maintain control over a vast, diverse population.
They needed conformity.
Right, they needed a standardized text. But because Ethiopia was so geographically removed, so protected from Roman ecclesiastical authority, they simply didn't have to conform to the decrees of those councils.
They were just completely out of the jurisdiction. I mean, the long arm of Roman standardization just couldn't reach over those mountains.
Precisely. And the source argues that this wasn't just a happy accident of geography. It actually allowed for the organic preservation of a massive, unbroken tradition of unmediated faith.
Unmediated, meaning no middleman.
Exactly. While the West was building a tightly controlled, highly structured institutional framework where the boundaries of Scripture were heavily policed, the Ethiopian monks were guarding a much wider, older, and more porous spiritual universe.
And hidden within that massive 88-book scriptural universe are the three specific texts we are focusing on today, which are the Books of Meqabyan.
Yes. And we should probably clarify something quickly for anyone listening who might be familiar with Catholic or Orthodox history.
Oh, right, because the names sound almost identical.
They do. If you've read the Catholic Bible, you might know the Books of the Maccabees. But our sources are emphatic about this. The Ethiopian Books of Meqabyan are completely different from those Western Greek texts.
Yeah, the Western Maccabees are primarily political and military chronicles, right?
Exactly. They document the Jewish rebellion against the Hellenistic Seleucid Empire in the 2nd century BCE. It's a very grounded historical account of a war for cultural survival.
It focuses on, like, military logistics and guerrilla tactics.
Right, and the political struggle to purify the temple in Jerusalem from foreign influence.
But the Ethiopian Book of 1 Meqabyan takes us in a totally different direction, and to a totally different era, actually.
It really does.
It introduces us to a hero named Maccabees. According to the text, he arose during the days of the Judges. And for some context, the days of the Judges is a much older pre-monarchy period in ancient Israel.
It was a very chaotic tribal era, long before there were kings or massive centralized temples.
Right. And Maccabees is described as a great man in Israel, mighty in battle. The text quotes him declaring to his people, and I'm quoting here, "Fear not, for the Lord our God is with us, and he will not forsake us."
A very powerful declaration.
It is. And the key takeaway from our sources is that Maccabees relied entirely on his unshakable faith to overcome impossible odds, completely bypassing massive religious institutions.
You didn't need the institutional backing.
Right. But okay, let's unpack this. I have to push back a little.
Go for it.
If Maccabees is just a great warrior driving out enemies, how is this actually different from a standard military history? I mean, a general rallying his troops and saying, God is on our side, is pretty much the oldest trope in the history of warfare.
It's a very fair critique. But we have to look closely at the underlying mechanics of the narrative to see the difference.
Okay, what am I missing?
The distinction our source is making is really one of theological focus. In the Western text, the victory is achieved through military strategy and a structured institutional desire to restore the formal priesthood.
They want the temple sacrifices back.
Exactly. The Ethiopian one, Meqabyan, however, is framed by our sources as a mystical account of faith rather than a logistical one.
A mystical account. What does that actually mean for Maccabees on the ground?
It means the text emphasizes that the true source of Maccabees' power is his direct, unmediated connection to the divine. He doesn't need to consult a high priest for permission to fight.
He doesn't need a middleman.
Right. He doesn't wait for a complex ritual of sacrifice to ensure victory. The power flows directly from the divine to the individual believer right there on the battlefield.
Wow. So it's like the democratization of divine empowerment.
That's a great way to phrase it. He acts autonomously because his faith grants him direct access to divine authority. And according to our source material, this is precisely what made these texts so dangerous to the centralized authorities later on.
Because it champions the individual.
Exactly. An individual who is directly empowered, bypassing the institutional middleman entirely.
That makes a lot of sense. So Book 1 establishes this blueprint of the unmediated hero in the physical world, out on the battlefield.
The physical struggle, yes.
So if this radical self-reliance works in physical combat, what happens when you apply it to the internal life of the believer? Because that seems to be exactly where the narrative goes next.
It is. The transition from the first book to the second is a definitive shift from the physical realm to the spiritual and moral realm.
Yeah, our sources say that the second book of Meqabyan was written as a, quote, memorial unto the children of Israel, and it is intensely focused on the absolute nature of divine justice.
It really doesn't pull any punches regarding justice.
Not at all. It explicitly says, the Lord is just in all his ways and holy in all his works, and it promises that The wicked shall receive the recompense of their deeds.
It's entirely about personal moral development.
Right. And to use an analogy here, imagine you've been accused of a crime and you are standing outside this massive, imposing courthouse.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The traditional institutional model tells you that you must hire an expensive, highly specialized lawyer to go inside and speak to the judge on your behalf.
Because you aren't qualified to do it yourself.
Exactly. You aren't allowed to talk to the judge yourself. You don't know the Latin language. You don't know the rituals of the court.
You need the mediator.
But Meqabyan is essentially saying, you don't need the lawyer. You can walk right into that cosmic courtroom and represent yourself directly. You have the direct line to the judge, and the judge's justice is absolute and fair.
It's a very empowering concept.
It is. But I have to ask, is this concept of representing yourself in a cosmic courtroom really what our sources claim made the institutional church so furious?
What's fascinating here is that it absolutely is. Because you have to consider the economic and structural power dynamics that our source is implying.
The power dynamics of the medieval church.
Yes. Think about how a highly centralized, hierarchical religious institution functions, particularly in the ancient and medieval world. Its primary authority, and frankly its primary value proposition to the masses, is that it acts as the necessary exclusive bridge between flawed humans and a perfect divine.
Ah, I see. They hold the keys to the kingdom. If you want in, you have to go through their door.
Exactly. The institution positions itself as the sole mediator of human morality and forgiveness. If you sin, you go to the priest. You confess to the priest. You perform the sacrament prescribed by the institution.
And the institution dispenses the grace.
Right. It is a highly controlled spiritual economy. But our source argues that 2 Meqabyan completely bypasses that entire system.
Because if divine justice is absolute,
And if an individual can navigate their own moral development through a direct, unmediated relationship with the divine, then the institution loses its monopoly on salvation.
it loses its leverage.
Leverage is the perfect word.
Because if I don't need a priest to forgive me, the threat of excommunication suddenly loses all its teeth.
Precisely. According to the narrative we are examining, the Western Church marginalized these texts precisely because a direct form of divine justice rendered their incredibly powerful and profitable role completely obsolete.
The ultimate mediator becomes useless.
Right. And the psychological shift for a believer realizing they don't need a mediator is profound. It transforms them from a dependent subject into an empowered individual.
Wow. Okay, so Book 1 proves you don't need a middleman for spiritual power and physical struggles.
Check.
Book 2 proves you don't need a middleman for moral development or divine forgiveness.
Right.
So if this radical self-reliance completely rewrites individual morality, what happens when an entire society adopts it? Does the text scale this up?
It absolutely scales it up. It scales it to the ultimate cosmic endgame.
Book 3.
Yes. Book 3 is the logical conclusion of this trajectory. It answers the ultimate question: where does a world of directly empowered, unmediated individuals actually lead humanity?
According to 3 Meqabyan, it leads to a breathtaking prophecy of the last days and the coming of the kingdom of God.
It's a very vivid vision.
Very vivid. The text promises that the righteous shall inherit the earth. And it paints this incredible utopian vision of ultimate peace. It declares that there shall be no more war, and the nations shall learn war no more, because the knowledge of the Lord shall cover the earth as the waters cover the sea.
That specific imagery, as the waters cover the sea, is incredibly profound.
It's beautiful.
It implies a total, inescapable saturation of divine knowledge. It's not localized in the temple or contained in a specific sacrament. It is everywhere, accessible to everyone all at once.
So what does this all mean? When I read that, it sparked a huge aha moment for me regarding our source's argument.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because if everyone inherently has this knowledge of the Lord, if it is literally covering the earth like water, doesn't a prophecy like that render religious institutions not just obsolete, but literally impossible to maintain?
What do you mean?
I mean, you literally cannot put a toll booth on the ocean.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. And it strikes at the very heart of the source's argument. A universal destiny of inherent, saturated divine knowledge leaves absolutely no room for ecclesiastical authorities demanding compliance.
Because everyone already has the access.
Exactly. If the end goal of humanity is a state where everyone intuitively knows the divine, where the entire earth is effectively the temple, then any institution claiming exclusive rights to mediate that knowledge is inherently temporary.
Temporary, or maybe even in the way.
Yes, it might even be viewed as an obstacle to that ultimate peace. The source strongly suggests that a vision of humanity's destiny that transcends any single religious structure was simply too radical, too universally empowering for a Western world heavily invested in building a centralized church empire.
You just can't control an ocean of believers who don't need your toll booth.
You really can't.
It's an incredibly compelling philosophical progression. But let's be real, there's a bit of irony here.
The modern
Yeah. A text that advocates for completely unmediated access to the divine is currently being heavily mediated, packaged, and distributed by modern publishers.
It is an interesting paradox.
We have to look at why these ancient texts are suddenly being championed right now, today, by these specific authors.
Analyzing the delivery mechanism and the modern framing of the message is just as important as analyzing the ancient message itself.
And our sources are incredibly direct with their modern audience. Their ultimate argument is that ecclesiastical authorities needed a compliant population, so they systematically erased the heroes of the Meqabyan who taught this radical, unmediated faith.
That is the core claim.
But they aren't just giving us a dry history lesson here. They are utilizing a very specific call to action.
They want the reader to do something.
Exactly. They essentially tell you, the reader, you don't have to settle for that sanitized, filtered version of history anymore. You are a truth seeker, destined to reclaim this stolen spiritual heritage.
It's a very motivating setup.
And then they very specifically direct you into a modern marketing funnel to buy it.
The transition from theological exposition to commercial transaction is quite explicit.
Very explicit.
Yeah.
They point out that Echelon Nexus Press has meticulously published this entire tradition. They tell you to go pick up Volume 2B, which contains the unique Ethiopian Old Testament books, including these three alongside Enoch and Jubilees.
They lay it all out for you.
They even give you the specific website, bibledetails.com/start. And of course, they highly recommend grabbing Volume 7, which is the comprehensive study guide.
Right.
Now, looking at this objectively, there is a clear commercial angle here. Our source is actively selling these books. So I have to ask, does framing a historical text as a suppressed secret deliberately hidden by corrupt elites just make for brilliant political spin and an incredibly effective marketing strategy to modern readers?
This raises an important question about modern psychology, because it absolutely taps into a deep psychological appeal.
People love a secret.
There is an undeniable allure to the hidden knowledge narrative. When you tell someone that powerful forces conspired for centuries to keep a secret specifically from them, it immediately creates a sense of intrigue and importance.
It makes it personal.
It elevates the text.
Yeah.
It's no longer just an obscure historical document from East Africa. It becomes a vital piece of stolen heritage that the reader is uncovering.
It makes you feel like Indiana Jones uncovering the Lost Ark, you know? Rather than a grad student reading a dusty scroll in a library. You get to be the rebel uncovering the truth.
Exactly. The narrative of reclaimed stolen heritage is incredibly empowering for the individual. And notice how perfectly it aligns with the very themes of the Meqabyan texts themselves.
Oh, wow, yeah. Bypassing the traditional authorities to find direct truth.
Exactly. From a purely analytical standpoint, it is a highly sophisticated way to engage a modern audience that is inherently skeptical of large institutions, whether those are religious, political, or media institutions.
The marketing mirrors the theology.
It does. However, as we navigate this, I want to emphasize the importance of separating the historical reality of the texts from the modern marketing wrapper.
That's a vital distinction to make.
Because the books of 1, 2, and 3 Meqabyan are real historical texts that have been preserved for centuries by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. The 88-book canon is a historical reality.
Right, nobody is making that part up.
No. But the aggressive narrative of intentional malicious Western suppression, the idea of European councils sitting in a room twirling their mustaches, actively scheming to hide these specific heroes to keep you docile, that is the specific interpretive lens and marketing strategy of our modern source material.
Right. It's a lens used to sell the books today. Well, we've looked at a fascinating progression today.
It really covered a lot of ground.
We didn't just walk through a list of ancient books. We tracked an entire philosophy of individual empowerment. We saw how the geographical fortress of the Ethiopian highlands protected a tradition where a hero like Maccabees could bypass the priests and find direct power on the battlefield.
In Book 1.
Right. And then we saw how that evolved into a cosmic courtroom in Book 2, where the individual doesn't need a lawyer to seek divine justice, effectively stripping the medieval church of its greatest leverage.
The monopoly on forgiveness.
Exactly. And finally, we saw how that philosophy scales up in Book 3 to a utopian vision of the future, A world covered in an ocean of knowledge where institutional toll booths are completely impossible.
And then the modern twist.
Yes, seeing that ancient rebellion being packaged and sold to a modern world hungry for unmediated truth.
It is profound trajectory, moving from the ancient, impenetrable highlands of East Africa all the way to the modern digital marketplace. And as we conclude our analysis of these sources today, I'd actually like to leave you with a thought to mull over, building on that initial concept of geographical isolation.
Oh, I like where this is going.
We noted earlier that the physical reality of the Ethiopian terrain, the deep gorges and sheer mountains, was absolutely required to protect these radical, unmediated ideas from being homogenized by the centralized empires of the ancient world. They needed a physical fortress to survive the pressure of conformity.
Because if they hadn't been geographically unreachable, they would have been standardized right out of existence.
Exactly. So my question for you is this. What is the equivalent of those highlands today?
Oh, wow.
In our intensely hyperconnected world where every single idea is instantly broadcast, filtered, categorized, and quickly institutionalized by algorithms and massive digital platforms, where do the truly radical, unmediated ideas go to survive?
That is a phenomenal question.
Is there a geographical or perhaps a digital fortress left that can protect an original idea from being homogenized by the modern empire of algorithmic consensus?
Because if you don't have deep gorges to hide in, how do you keep a radical idea from becoming just another standardized product? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It has been a wild ride through history, the mechanics of theology, and the incredible power of a good narrative. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we will see you next time.